6 months had passed since the council meeting, and Una 7 now carried the title of Senior Archivist following Melith's retirement to the Contemplation Halls. She stood in her office overlooking the great atrium of the repository, watching data streams flow across her displays as reports came in from across the galaxy. The notification that changed everything arrived without fanfare. Just another entry in the endless flow of information that the Dasari collected and categorized. A border conflict had erupted in the outer reaches between the Keth Dominion and a smaller species called the Valori. The details were depressingly familiar. The Keth wanted resources that the Valori controlled. The Valori refused to surrender their ancestral territories. The Keth assembled a war fleet and began moving toward Valori space under normal circumstances. This would have ended predictably. The Valori were outnumbered and outgunned. Their fleet consisted of perhaps 20 vessels, none larger than a light cruiser. The Keth had assembled 40 warships, including 3 dreadnoughts capable of reducing a planet to ash. The galactic community had already begun drafting surrender terms that would preserve the Valori as a species while granting the Keth what they wanted. It was the logical outcome. It was the merciful outcome. It was the outcome that every behavioral model predicted with near certainty. But the Dasari had not accounted for the human merchant vessel that happened to be in Valori space when the Keth fleet arrived. The ship was called the Steadfast Promise, a mid-sized freighter with a crew of 47 humans. It had been delivering agricultural equipment to a Valori farming colony when the proximity alarms announced the arrival of the Keth war fleet. Standard procedure in such situations was clear. Neutral vessels were expected to flee the conflict zone and report what they had witnessed. There was no shame in retreat, and there was no logical reason to remain. The Steadfast Promise did not flee. Captain Yongho of the Steadfast Promise broadcast a message that the entire sector picked up within minutes. "This is the human vessel Steadfast Promise," he said, his voice calm and steady. "We are currently positioned between the Keth fleet and the Valori colony. We do not intend to move." The Keth commander responded with what the translators interpreted as confusion. "Human vessel," he said. "You are a freighter. You carry no weapons capable of threatening our fleet. Your presence here serves no tactical purpose. I advise you to withdraw before you are destroyed." Captain Yongho's response became famous across 12 systems within the day. "We are aware of our tactical limitations," he said. "We are aware that our vessel cannot stop your fleet. We are aware that if you choose to fire upon us, we will die. We are staying anyway." The Keth commander demanded an explanation. The captain's response was simple. "There are 3,000 Valori civilians on this colony," he said. "They are farmers and teachers and children. If we leave, you will reach them in 6 hours. Our presence here will not stop you from reaching them eventually, but it will slow you down while you decide what to do about us, and every hour you spend deciding is an hour those civilians have to prepare." The Keth fleet stopped. Una read the intelligence reports with growing amazement as she pieced together what had happened next. The Keth had studied the Dasari behavioral models extensively. Before launching their campaign, they knew that rational beings did not sacrifice themselves for strangers. They knew that survival instinct would override abstract principles when death became certain. They knew that one freighter could not possibly believe it could make a difference against 40 warships, but the freighter was not moving for 6 hours. The Keth fleet hung motionless in space while the commanders debated what to do. Some argued for simply destroying the human vessel and proceeding with the invasion. Others pointed out that humans had proven unpredictable in the past. If one freighter was willing to die for the Valori, how many more might follow? What else might humans be willing to do that the Keth had not anticipated? While the debate continued, the Valori colony sent out distress signals on every frequency. The signals reached a human patrol fleet that had been conducting exercises 3 systems away 6 hours after the Steadfast Promise took its position. 12 human warships emerged from faster-than-light travel and formed a battle line beside the freighter. The commander of the human fleet broadcast a simple message. The steadfast promise has declared its intention to protect these people. She said, the Terran Navy stands with them. The Keth commander faced a choice that his behavioral models had not prepared him for. He had expected the humans to flee. He had expected rational calculation to override any abstract principles. He had expected that one freighter could not possibly matter. Instead, he faced a species that had just demonstrated its willingness to die for strangers. A species that sent warships to support a single merchant captain's impossible stand. A species that wrote poetry about exactly this kind of moment. The Keth fleet withdrew 3 days later. Diplomatic negotiations began that would eventually grant the Valori protection under a mutual defense treaty with humanity. Yuna finished reading the reports and sat in silence for a long time. She thought about what Director Quan Su had told her on Earth, about the freedom that came when survival was no longer the primary concern, about the discovery that thinking beings could be more than their fear. She thought about Captain Yongho, who had positioned his unarmed freighter between a war fleet and a colony full of strangers, knowing exactly what it would cost him. She thought about the songs humans would write about this day, about the poetry they would compose, and the stories they would tell their children. Then she opened a new file in the repository's database and began writing a new entry for humanity. She started with the standard categories: homeworld, biology, technological level, first contact date. But when she reached the section on cultural characteristics, she paused. Standard classifications did not seem adequate anymore. She deleted what she had written and started again. Humans do not sing of glorious defeats because they wish to lose. She wrote, they sing of them because they wish all who listen to know that losing is not the same as being defeated. The body may fall, the fleet may burn. The battle may be lost, but the choice stands eternal. A species that teaches its children to find beauty in impossible stands is a species that cannot be conquered, because even when you destroy them, they have already won the only victory that matters to them. They have proven that they are more than their fear. They have chosen meaning over survival, and in doing so, they have become something that transcends the mathematics of war. She saved the entry and looked out at the stars somewhere out there. Captain Yongho was probably being celebrated as a hero. Somewhere out there, humans were composing songs about the day a freighter stood between a war fleet and a farming colony. And somewhere out there, the Keth Dominion was learning the same lesson that the Thesari had learned months before. You cannot threaten those who have already accepted death. You cannot defeat those who have redefined victory. You can only stand in awe of a species that found something worth dying for and refused. To look away, Yuna closed her display and walked out into the repository. Surrounded by the collected wisdom of 4,000 civilizations, humanity's entry would grow over the centuries to come. But the core of it would always remain the same. They were the species that sang of glorious defeats, and in doing so, they had discovered something that made them impossible to destroy. The repository of Valanthus had never felt so quiet as it did on the day that the Thesari Council convened to discuss the human problem's senior curator. Malith sat at the head of a table that stretched the length of the great chamber, surrounded by the 11 elders who governed the collective's most important decisions. Yuna 7 stood at the presentation platform, her findings organized into careful categories that she hoped would help the council understand what she had learned. But understanding and accepting were different things. And she could already see resistance forming in the eyes of several elders. Let me summarize what we know, Malith said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from 3 centuries of service. Humans do not celebrate defeat itself. They celebrate the act of choosing to fight when victory is impossible. They find meaning and even beauty in the moment when survival no longer constrains their decisions. Elder Thiessen, the oldest member of the council, raised one appendage in the gesture that requested attention. This is interesting from a cultural perspective. he said. But I fail to see why it warranted an emergency session of the full council. Many species have unusual cultural practices. We catalog them and move forward. Una stepped forward to respond. But Malith gestured for her to wait. The concern is not cultural. He said, the concern is practical. He activated the central display and brought up the Galactic Behavioral Index, a massive database that the Asari had maintained for thousands of cycles. The index contained predictive models for every known spacefaring species, allowing the galactic community to anticipate how different civilizations would respond to various situations. Diplomats use these models to negotiate treaties. Merchants use them to structure trade agreements. Military strategists use them to prevent conflicts before they began. Every model in this index, Malith said, operates on a fundamental assumption that all thinking beings will act in their own self-interest when survival is at stake. Species might sacrifice individuals for the good of the group. A species might accept short-term losses for long-term gains, but ultimately, every species we have ever encountered will choose survival when the alternative is extinction. He paused and let the silence stretch. Our models for humanity do not function. He said, when we attempt to predict human behavior using standard parameters, the models produce contradictory results. Human history is filled with moments where individuals and groups acted directly against their own survival, not for the benefit of their species, not for strategic advantage, simply because they chose to stand when standing meant dying. Elder Korath, who oversaw the collective's diplomatic relations, leaned forward with obvious concern. Are you suggesting that humans cannot be negotiated with? She asked. Every treaty in galactic history has been built on the assumption that all parties prefer survival to destruction. If humans do not share this preference, how can we trust any agreement we make with them? Una finally spoke, unable to remain silent any longer. It is more complicated than that. She said, humans do value survival. They fear death as much as any species, but they have developed a cultural framework that allows them to override that fear when they believe the circumstances demand it. They can choose death over survival if they decide that dying serves a greater purpose. And they have built their entire civilization around honoring those who make that choice. The council members exchanged glances that communicated volumes of concern. Elder Thiessen spoke again, his voice slower now, as if he were working through a difficult calculation. Let me see if I understand. He said, when we negotiate with other species, we can predict their behavior because we know they will ultimately act to preserve themselves. We can threaten them with destruction, and they will yield. We can offer them survival, and they will accept. But humans have taught themselves to see certain deaths as victories. They have raised generations of offspring to believe that dying well is equal to or greater than living at all. He paused and looked around the table. What do you offer a species that considers dying gloriously to be victory? He asked. What do you threaten them with? The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Malith brought up additional data on the display. There is more. He said, we have analyzed human military history extensively. We have found numerous examples of human forces that were offered favorable surrender terms and refused, not because they believed they could win, not because surrender would have meant mistreatments, simply because they chose to fight. He showed the council records of battles where human forces had been outnumbered 10 to 1, 100 to 1, and still refused to yield. In each case, the humans had known exactly what awaited them. In each case, they had calculated the odds and found them impossible. And in each case, they had stood their ground until the end. The Keth Dominion has expressed interest in expanding into human-occupied territory, Elder Korath said quietly. They asked us for behavioral predictions before opening negotiations. They wanted to know how humans would respond to shows of force. Malith nodded slowly. And what did we tell them? He asked. We told them we could not provide reliable predictions. Korath admitted we told them our models were incomplete. We did not tell them that the models might never be complete, because we do not know how to model a species that finds freedom in certain death. Elder Thiessen stood, a gesture that indicated he wished to address the full council. I have lived for over 400 cycles. He said, I have watched empires rise and fall. I have seen species that seemed invincible brought low by their own arrogance, and I have learned one truth above all others, the most dangerous opponent is not the one with the greatest weapons or the largest armies. The most dangerous opponent is the one you cannot predict. He looked at each council member and turned. Humans are that opponent. He said, not because they are stronger than us, not because they are smarter than us, but because they have found something that exists beyond our understanding. They have found meaning in places where meaning should not exist. They have found victory in circumstances where victory is impossible, and may have passed this discovery down through generations until it is woven into the very fabric of their being. He sat back down, his shell settling with a weight that spoke of great age and great concern. I do not recommend war with humanity. He said, I do not recommend conflict of any kind, because I do not know how to defeat a species that does not believe defeat is possible. The council sat in heavy silence as the implications washed over them. Somewhere in the galaxy, a young species was teaching its children to sing about last stands and the Visari, who had believed they understood all the ways that thinking beings could think, were only beginning to realize how much that changed everything. The diplomatic vessel, gentle understanding, cut through the darkness between stars, its elegant form reflecting the Visari belief that beauty and function should never be separated. Inside the main observation deck, Senior Archivist Una 7 stood beside Junior Archivist Dowan, watching the yellow star grow larger in the viewing window. Earth hung before them like a blue and white jewel, and Una found herself wondering what kind of world could produce a species that sang about sinking ships. The Human Cultural Exchange Commission had responded to their request with surprising enthusiasm. Director Quan Su had personally invited the Zasari delegation to visit the primary facility in a city called Geneva, and she had promised full cooperation with their research. Una did not know what to expect from this meeting, but she had prepared over 200 questions in hopes of understanding what the archivists had uncovered. The landing was smooth, and the Visari delegation emerged into bright sunlight that felt strange against their shells after so many years in the controlled environment of the repository. Director Quan Su waited at the base of the landing platform, her expression warm and welcoming in a way that seemed genuine rather than diplomatic. Welcome to Earth, she said, her voice carrying easily across the distance between them. I understand you have questions about our cultural expressions. Una stepped forward and performed the gesture of scholarly greeting that the Zari used when meeting those who held knowledge they sought. We are grateful for your willingness to help us understand, she said. We have studied the cultural artifacts of over 4,000 civilizations, and we have encountered something in your works that we cannot explain. Quan Su tilted her head slightly. A gesture that Una had learned indicated curiosity in humans. Please, she said, tell me what confuses you. I have spent my career studying how other species perceive humanity, and I am always eager to hear new perspectives. They walked together through corridors decorated with human art, and Una noticed that several pieces depicted the very scenes that had troubled the archivists. A painting of soldiers standing firm against impossible odds hung beside a tealed statue of a woman holding a torch in a harbor. Everything seemed designed to remind visitors of human history and human values when they reached a comfortable meeting room. Kwon-Soo gestured for the Dasari to sit and took her own place across from them. "Now," she said, "what is it about our art that troubles you so deeply?" Yuna activated a small holographic projector and displayed the images and recordings that the archivists had analyzed. "Your species celebrates defeat," she said simply. "You write poetry about last stands where everyone dies. You sing songs about ships that sink. With all hands aboard, you build monuments to those who lost battles and lost their lives. We do not understand why." Kwon-Soo studied the images floating between them, her expression shifting through several emotions that Yuna could not quite identify. After a long moment, the human spoke. "You think these are celebrations of defeat," she said, "but that is not what they are." Yuna gestured toward a painting of soldiers frozen in the snow of a Russian winter. "These soldiers lost," she said. "They retreated, they died. Your own records confirm this. Ours memorializing their deaths, not celebrating their defeat." Kwon-Soo leaned forward, and something in her eyes suggested she was searching for words to express something that felt obvious to her, but impossible to explain. "You are correct that they lost," she said. "We know exactly what happened. We count our dead with great care. We remember every name when we can. But you are wrong about what we celebrate." Dowan spoke up, his voice carrying the frustration of someone who had spent weeks trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "Then what do you celebrate?" he asked. "If not the defeat itself, what is it about these moments that your species finds so worthy of remembrance?" Kwon-Soo was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "Let me ask you a question," she said. "In your long study of other species, have you ever encountered a situation where survival was truly impossible, where there was no path to victory and no chance of escape?" Yuna considered the question carefully. "Such situations are rare," she said. "Most thinking beings will find a way to survive. If any possibility exists, we will negotiate or surrender or flee. Survival is the foundation upon which all other values rest." "Exactly," Kwon-Soo said, and there was something almost sad in her voice. "For most species, survival is the ultimate value. Everything else comes after. But humans have discovered something that exists beyond survival. We have found a place where survival no longer matters, and in that place, we find out what we truly are." She stood and walked to the window. "Looking out at the city below, any species can fight when winning is possible," she said. "Any thinking being can struggle to survive when survival seems achievable. But what happens when survival becomes impossible? What happens when you know with absolute certainty that you will die no matter what you do?" Yuna felt something shift in her understanding, like a door opening to reveal a room she had not known existed in that moment. Kwon-Soo continued, "You are free, completely free. Survival no longer constrains your choices. Fear of death no longer guides your actions. You can finally see what you truly value, because survival is no longer competing for your attention." She turned back to face the Zari. The soldiers at Thermopylae knew they would die. The defenders of the Alamo knew they would die. The sailors on the Titanic knew they would die, and in knowing this, they were free to choose how they would die. They chose to stand. They chose to fight. They chose to give meaning to their last moments rather than simply trying to extend them. Yuna felt the weight of understanding settle over her like a heavy cloak. "You celebrate the choice," she said slowly, "not the outcome." Kwon-Soo smiled, and Yuna saw in that expression something that looked almost like relief. "Yes," she said, "we sing about glorious defeats because the glory is not in the dying. The glory is in the choosing. The glory is in looking at certain death and deciding that some things matter more than another breath. We celebrate these moments because they show us what humans can be when everything else is stripped away." Dowan spoke quietly. almost to himself, a species that finds freedom in certain death. He said, a species that sees its truest self only when survival is impossible. Quan Su nodded. Now you begin to understand. She said, we do not celebrate defeat. We celebrate the discovery that we are more than our fear. We are more than our survival instinct. We are beings who can choose meaning over existence, and we never want to forget that. This is possible. Yuna looked at the images still floating in the air between them, and for the first time she saw them differently, not as monuments to failure, but as windows into something that transcended victory and defeat entirely. She understood now, even if she could not quite feel what humans felt when they sang these songs, but understanding and comfort were different things entirely, and she suspected that the full implications of what she had learned would trouble the Thesari for a very long time. The analysis chambers at the Grand Repository hummed with activity as a team of 12 Thesari archivists gathered around a central holographic display that stretched from floor to ceiling. Yuna 7 stood at the primary console, organizing data streams while her colleagues settled into their designated stations. Senior Curator Malith had given them unlimited access to the human cultural database, and the scope of what they faced was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Junior Archivist Dowan was the youngest member of the team, barely 30 cycles old, and still carrying the eager brightness that faded in most Thesari after their first century of work. He had been assigned to categorize human visual arts, and he approached his station with the enthusiasm of someone who did not yet understand what he was about to discover. The work began in silence as each archivist dove into their assigned category. Yuna monitored the progress from her central position, watching as patterns began to emerge across all the data streams within the first 3 hours. Dowan raised his appendage to request attention. I have found something that requires group analysis, he said, his voice carrying notes of confusion that the others recognized immediately. He transferred his findings to the central display, and the chamber fell silent as the images appeared. The first painting showed a group of human soldiers standing on a wooden bridge while fire consumed the structure beneath their feet. The translation identified it as a depiction of an event where a small group held a bridge against an army to allow civilians to escape, knowing the flames would take them along with the enemy. The second painting showed humans in primitive armor forming a wall with their bodies against a charging mass of enemies. The translation noted that this was a memorial to a battle where the defenders were outnumbered 10-1, and not a single one survived. The third painting showed a human ship listing heavily as water poured through holes in its hull, while sailors continued to fire weapons at enemy vessels. The inscription beneath it honored those who fought until the waves took them. Dowan looked around at his colleagues with obvious distress. I thought perhaps these were warnings, he said. I thought humans might display such images to teach their young what happens when you make foolish decisions. But I've read the accompanying texts. These are not warnings. These are celebrations. He brought up a series of written passages that accompanied the paintings. The language was unmistakable in its tone. Words like glory and honor and eternal appeared again and again. The dead were not pitied. They were envied. Yuna stepped forward and added her own findings to the display. I have been analyzing human music, she said, and the pattern holds. She played a recording of voices singing in harmony, the melody rising and falling like waves on a shore. The song told the story of a group of humans who refused to leave a place called Rock's Drift, even when surrounded by thousands of enemies. They sang through the night. The translation noted, to let the enemy know they were still alive and still willing to fight. The song treated this as a moment of supreme beauty rather than desperate foolishness. Another archivist named Thiessen brought up his analysis of human literature. The pattern deepens. He said, I have found entire categories of human storytelling devoted to what they call last stands. These stories follow a specific structure. A small group faces an overwhelming enemy. Retreat is possible, but rejected. The group fights until death takes them all, and then the story ends not with mourning but with something humans call immortality. They believe that by dying in such a manner, the individuals escape the forgetting that comes to all beings. Malith had been watching from the back of the chamber, and now he moved forward to address the group. Let us consider this logically. He said, every behavior serves a purpose. Every cultural expression emerges from some need. What need could possibly be served by celebrating failure and death? Darwin offered a hesitant theory. Perhaps it encourages others to fight harder. He said, if humans believe that dying in battle brings glory, they might be more willing to take risks in combat. Una shook her head slowly. That does not explain the specificity. She said humans do not celebrate all deaths in combat. They celebrate very particular kinds of death. The common element is not simply dying while fighting. The common element is choosing to fight when survival is impossible. Choosing to stand when running would save your life. Choosing certain death over any alternative. Thiessen brought up another set of documents. These are human educational materials. He said, they teach these stories to their young children, memorize the names of those who died at Thermopylae. They learn songs about the Alamo before they can fully understand what war means. They are raised from birth to see these deaths as something to aspire to rather than avoid. The chamber was quiet as the implications settled over the assembled. Archivist Malith spoke slowly, as if working through a difficult equation. If I understand correctly, he said, humans do not simply accept that such deaths happen. They actively teach their offspring to view such deaths as desirable. They create an entire cultural framework that treats dying well as equal to or greater than living well. Una confirmed with a gesture. It goes further. She said, I have found evidence that humans who survive situations where others died heroically often express something called survivor's guilt. They feel shame for living when others died. They wish they had been among those who fell down and made. A sound of pure incomprehension, but survival is the primary drive of all thinking beings. He said, how can a species feel shame for doing what every instinct demands? Una looked at the young archivist with something like sympathy. That is the question we must answer, she said, and I do not think we will find the answer in their art alone. We need to speak with them directly. Malith considered this for a long moment before responding. I will contact the Cultural Exchange Division. He said, we will request a meeting with human representatives, but I want every archivist in this room to understand something before we proceed. In 4,000 cycles of studying alien cultures, we have never encountered anything like this. We are not simply cataloging a new species. We are confronting a way of thinking that challenges everything we believe about the nature of rational beings. He paused and looked at the images still floating in the air around them. The paintings of doomed soldiers and sinking ships and burning bridges. Prepare your questions carefully, he said, because I suspect the answers will disturb us far more than the mystery itself. The archivists dispersed to their stations, each carrying the weight of what they had discovered somewhere in the galaxy. A young species was teaching its children to sing songs about beautiful deaths and glorious defeats, and the sorry, who had believed they understood all the ways that thinking beings could think, were only beginning to realize how wrong they had been. The grand repository of Volantis hung in the void like a sleeping giant, its crystalline spires catching the light of 3 distant suns and scattering it into rainbows that danced across the darkness of space. Senior Archivist Una 7 walked through corridors that stretched for kilometers, her forelegs clicking softly against floors that had been polished by millions of visitors over thousands of years. The Dazari Collective had built this place to hold the cultural memory of the galaxy itself. Every species that achieved spaceflight eventually found their way here. and every species left behind a piece of themselves in the form of art and music and literature. Yuna had worked in the repository for 60 cycles now, and she had seen the cultural expressions of over 200 different civilizations pass. Through her analysis chambers, she thought she understood the patterns that connected all thinking beings across the stars. The Corvani celebrated their great engineers with monuments of living metal. The Dreth composed symphonies that mapped the movements of their ancestral migration fleets. The Valori painted vast murals depicting the moment their species first touched another world. Every civilization found ways to honor their greatest achievements and their finest moments. This was the universal constant that Yuna had come to rely upon. Thinking beings everywhere wanted to remember when they had been at their best. Today she received a new data cache from the Cultural Exchange Division, and the label on the container made her pause. It reads simply, Humanity, third planet of Sol System. Recently contacted Yuna carried the cache to her private analysis chamber and inserted it into the reader with the careful movements of someone who had handled priceless artifacts for decades. The holographic display flickered to life, and thousands of files began organizing themselves into categories. Music filled the chamber first, and Yuna listened with growing confusion. The melody was stirring and powerful, but the words spoke of a ship called Titanic that sank beneath frozen waters while musicians played until the end. She moved to the next file and found a poem about a place called Thermopylae, where 300 warriors stood against an army of thousands knowing they would all die before the sun set. The next file contained a painting of soldiers freezing to death in snow, their faces gone and their eyes hollow, retreating from a place called Moscow. Yuna stopped the playback and checked the translation matrix 3 times. Surely something had gone wrong with the linguistic algorithms. No species celebrated such things. She accessed more files and found the same pattern repeating over and over. Songs about ships going down with all hands aboard. Poems about cavalry charges that rode straight into certain death. Stories about small groups holding impossible positions until they were wiped out to the last soldier, epic tales. About cities that burned rather than surrender. Yuna felt something cold settle in her chest, a sensation that the Sari called the shadow of wrongness. She gathered the most striking examples and made her way to the chambers of Senior Curator Malith. The curator was ancient even by the Sari standards, his shell marked with the ceremonial patterns of one who had served the repository for over 300 cycles. He listened to Yuna present her findings with the patience of someone who had heard countless anomalies explained away by faulty translation or cultural misunderstanding. When she finished, Malith waved one appendage dismissively. The translation matrix must be corrupted, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. No species memorializes failure. It serves no evolutionary purpose. Yuna had expected this response, so she activated the holographic display she had prepared. These are not isolated examples, she said, and she began showing him file after file. Here is a song about a fortress called the Alamo, where fewer than 200 humans fought against thousands until none remained. Here is a poem about a ship called the Hood that exploded in battle with only 3 survivors from a crew of over 1,400. Here is a painting called The Last Stand that depicts soldiers surrounded and dying, but still fighting. Here is a story about a general named Leonidas who told his enemies to come and take his weapons because he would not surrender them. Malith watched in silence as Yuna continued for nearly an hour. She showed him monuments built to honor those who had lost. She played him music composed to remember disasters. She read him words written to praise those who had chosen death over retreat. When she finally stopped, the chamber was quiet for a long time. Malith moved to his viewing window and stared out at the stars in 4,000 cycles. He said slowly, "We have cataloged the cultural expressions of 4,117 spacefaring civilizations. We have found species that celebrate war and species that celebrate peace. We have found species that honor their artists and species that honor their scientists. We have found species that remember their ancestors and species that look only to the future. But we have never found a species that writes poetry about their last stands and sings songs about their glorious defeats. He turned back to face Yuna, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. It looked almost like fear. "I am authorizing a full cultural analysis," Melith said, his voice now carrying a different kind of weight. "Assemble a team of our finest archivists. I want to understand what kind of species looks at death and failure and sees something worth celebrating." Yuna bowed in acknowledgement and turned to leave. But Melith stopped her with a final question. "Tell me," he said, "do these humans know that they lost these battles they sing about so proudly?" Yuna considered the question carefully before answering. "Yes, Senior Curator," she said, "they know exactly what happened. They count their dead with precision. They record every name when they can. They build monuments that list exactly how many fell and exactly how the end came. And still they call these moments glorious." Melith was silent for a moment. "Longer. That is what concerns me," he finally said. "A species that does not understand its failures is simply foolish, but a species that understands its failures completely and celebrates them anyway is something else entirely. I do not yet know what that something is, but I suspect we need to find out before the rest of the galaxy encounters these humans without warning." Yuna left the curator standing at his window, staring out at the stars as if searching for the small yellow sun that warmed the world where this strange species had learned to sing about sinking ships and honor their heroic defeats. She did not know it yet, but the analysis she was about to begin would change the way that the Sari understood courage and sacrifice and the meaning of victory itself. For now, she only knew that somewhere in the galaxy there existed a species that looked at certain death and found it beautiful. And that knowledge sat in her mind like a weight she could not put down.